Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. This week, we're looking at economics and specifically supply and demand, and why you must understand this if you're going to invest in property.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Tackling a big topic today, supply and demand. And it's another of those things like inflation that we've talked about before, and like a few other topics that affects absolutely everything, yet you tend not to think about it day to day. But having an understanding of it will make your property investments dramatically more successful. So that's the promise. Listen to a bit of economics and it'll make you a better property investor. That's the trade-off. Hopefully, though, it'll be fun because when you start to understand this stuff, a lot of things in everyday life start to make a lot more sense. So all that is coming up. Should be a really good episode. But first, Rob, we've both been on the move this week and you've had would you call it a successful trip to Switzerland?
Well, successful that I went there and came back, but unfortunately my football team went there and didn't come back with a trophy. So let's move on. Although I will say thank you and then hello to the few podcast listeners who actually I bumped into, which was really crazy. But I suppose there's a lot of football fans who listen to podcasts and support Liverpool too. So well done you. Good to see you there. And Rob, you're back in good old Blighty as well.
Yes, I am. I travelled back the other day here for a few bits that we've got coming up. We've got another summit coming up and we've got a yellow team training day coming up. So I'm back for all of that. But so far, the weather has been kind to me. It's not been too much of a shock. I will be demanding that I am supplied with more sunshine, though, if things do take a turn for the worse. And on that note, we should get straight into the news story, which is linked directly to the topic this week of supply and demand. And this is one that you dug out, Rob.
Yes, this is from David Smith, the economist. I'm sure we've mentioned him before on the podcast, probably way back when. But he writes in the Sunday Times, amongst other places, and has published books. But the thing I really like about him is he just makes it easy to digest. So check out his weekly stuff in the Sunday Times. Very, very good. It's in the business section. And also his Twitter handle, which we'll link to in the show notes. This week, the show notes are at thepropertyhub.net/supply and demand. But we've taken an article from a few weeks ago where he looked at supply and demand, and particularly how it affects property. And I thought, I can't believe, although we've touched on it and danced around the subject multiple times, we've never gone into it in any real depth. So let's use that news story as the one we're going to discuss and actually build a whole episode out on it. So that's what we're going to do.
Okay, so let's get into supply and demand then in general and then look at how it applies to property. When I was at university, I shared a house with a few people who were studying economics and they seemed to spend all their time drawing graphs with lines that kind of moved and intersected with things, and I had no idea what they were doing. I'm not convinced they did either. But anyway, economics always seemed really complicated and dry and lots of graphs, but actually it's really simple when you get down to what it really means. Supply and demand is about as simple as it gets. And it's made up of two things, the law of demand and the law of supply. So the law of demand states that a higher price means that a lower quantity is demanded, and a lower price means that a higher quantity is demanded. So Rob was probably demanding fewer beers in Switzerland where it was really expensive, and I was demanding a lot more wine in Spain where it's cheap. And the law of supply is the inverse of that. So a higher price means that a higher quantity will be supplied, and a lower price means that a lower quantity will be supplied, which again is really common sense, because if you get paid a lot for doing something, you'll be willing to do more of it. And if someone's not willing to pay you much, you're just going to stop.
So that's the law of demand and the law of supply. And of course, they work together. And Wikipedia, of course, sums this up nicely. In microeconomics, supply and demand is an economic model of price determination in a market. It concludes that in a competitive market, the unit price for a particular good or any traded item will vary until it settles at a point where the quantity demanded will equal the quantity supplied, resulting in economic equilibrium for price and quantity transacted. So it sounds a bit wordy, and if you're new to economics, it probably sounds a bit like your living room at university, Rob. But actually, it's really simple. If you put it in simple terms, if demand is weak and supply is strong, then prices fall, and vice versa. If supply is weak and demand is strong, then prices rise. So that's supply and demand.
Yeah, extremely simple, but also really powerful, because the idea is that if you just have a free market and leave everything to work itself out, then prices will settle at the level where people are happy to produce the right amount and people have to pay the right amount, and everything kind of balances out and you don't end up with shortages or surpluses. All very good, but how does this relate to property? Well, when it comes to property, Supply and demand isn't the only factor. Prices go up and prices go down, and there are several reasons for that, and it all depends on how these reasons are balanced out. So there are tax changes, as we have just seen. There's the availability of finance and credit. There's market sentiment, which is a big one as well. All of these can impact the property market in the short to medium term. Over the long term, though, in the UK, the price trend has generally been up. It's gone down as well, but it's generally been up. And the reason for that is supply and demand. Very simply, if we don't build enough homes, property prices will rise.
And we don't build enough homes. So that's why property prices continue to rise over the long term. So let's look a little bit more deeply into that. Well, the best place to start with this would be the Barker report. It's put together by Kate Barker in 2004. And the government at the time asked her to look at the property market, the property crisis, you could say, and say, what can we do about this? What do we need to do to alleviate the housing crisis? What needs to happen? And this document is a juicy one. You probably don't want to read it all. But actually, all that the report came out with that you need to know is that it said that we need to build 250,000 new homes in the UK every single year, not once, every single year, for us to meet demand. Since that report came out in 2004, we've not hit that target once. And you could argue that that number needs to move upwards, because if we haven't hit it once, then it probably needs to be revised to make up for the shortfall we've missed for the last 10, 11 years. And what this does is it really highlights the supply and demand issue. We need 250,000 new homes. We build a lot less than that. So supply and demand issues take place, and then prices are pushed upwards. And as we said, yes, in the short to medium term, there are variations, but we need to build 250,000 new homes. And Rob, that's what we need to build. We're not hitting it, but how far away are we?
Fairly far away. I mean, last year, fewer than 150,000 homes were built, which is not only below the target, but like you said, the target is always actually increasing because we keep missing the target. Now, everyone recognises that this is an issue. It's socially and it's politically a very important issue, because if you've got people who can't afford somewhere to live, they're going to be very unhappy. And so politically, this is difficult. So, maybe in an ideal world, you'd click your fingers and all these new homes would appear and everything would be fine. It's a lot more difficult than that, though. This is not an easy problem to solve, which is why we've had over a decade of not really getting anywhere close to it. It comes down to money, it comes down to incentives, it comes down to planning, it comes down to the house builders and the profit motive for them. It comes down to a lot of different reasons why this isn't something where you can just go, we need 250,000 homes, fine, let's do that. It's a very challenging thing. And in the UK in particular, the planning system makes it challenging. And this is where you kind of get into the realms of NIMBYism, where it's just like, yes, everyone recognises we need these new homes, but nobody wants it next to them, or nobody wants it on a greenfield site and all that kind of thing. It is really difficult. That is why this problem is just getting exacerbated year over year. Every government comes in with its own ideas of how it's going to sort out the supply side. But it's a very difficult thing to do. It's a supply side issue. It's very difficult to get the number that we need. And the demand side of the equation certainly isn't cooling down.
It isn't. And that number, 150,000 homes, to give you an idea, that's actually a good number over the last 10 years. But then you look at the demand, like Rob said, and you go, okay, well why is this happening? Well, there's quite a few reasons. First of all, look at the lending products we discussed last week, how they're easing up for first-time buyers. 100% loan-to-value available for some people. You've got the bank of mum and dad. People are putting first-time buyers onto the market who weren't in the market before. So this is new demand pressures, combined with the Help to Buy scheme. All these things pushing for more people who want homes. People are living longer as well. So you have to consider that. And the way we live has changed as well. So if you think about, you look at how people used to live 100, even 50 years ago, you had multiple people to every property. But now the average is around about 2 people. It's actually just short of that, 1.8 or 1.9 people per property. So the way we like to live, we like our own space as well. So living habits, more first-time buyers, people living longer, immigration, all these things put together put pressure on the demand. And to give you an idea, last year in the UK, the population grew by 500,000. That's a huge number. 500,000 the population grew by. for multiple reasons. So that's not just immigration, people are living longer, so you have to remember that too. And this is fine as long as you can house these people, but we can't. And this is the problem and the challenge that every single government has had and will continue to have. And as Rob's already said, it's not easy to solve, that we will keep having these demand factors pushing and pushing and pushing, resulting in price increases over the long term. But that's not it, Rob. We've got the UK reasons and demand pressures, but there's also international pressures as well.
Yeah, and this is something I feel like I've been banging on about quite a bit recently, but I do think it's important. It's the overseas demand as well as the domestic demand, because this is where you've got this weird tension where property is not just a place to live, it's also an asset class. That's the perspective we're coming at for this podcast. We're thinking about it as an asset class. And UK property as a global asset class is extremely attractive because we've got all these factors in place that mean it's likely to continue rising, because we've got all this demand and such constrained supply, because we've got a stable legal system and political-ish system. For many, many reasons, UK property is an attractive place for the world to invest. And this is a whole separate supply and demand factor. Even with just the domestic demand, there'd be more that we can handle. But even when the government sort of tries to throttle back things in this country, so you've got all the tax changes that we've seen recently to try and cool things down, you've still got this international global demand, which isn't going anywhere. You've got all the new build stuff, which is marketed overseas. We've heard recently about all the people in the whole Panama Papers thing, where you've got all these companies buying London property. That, of course, forces up the price in central London. It ripples out to the rest of the country. It is a huge, huge factor as well. So we'll come on to the summary. What does this all mean? Well, this links to something we're going to be talking about next week. The impact, of course, is that house prices go up. And the impact of this is largely on people who are yet to buy. So we've had 20 years of pretty stonking house price growth. And yes, we had 2008, but if you look at a graph, it just looks like a little blip now, because funnily enough, when we started the podcast, that wasn't the case. It felt like we was in a bit of a trough, but when you look at the growth over the last couple of years, you can barely see it. Someone who's had 20 years of that growth can remortgage and tap into some of their equity and buy more properties as a pension if they want to, or they can live off that wealth in some other kind of way, which further increases the demand side. Somebody who's just coming in now is going to struggle significantly. And I won't say much more on that topic because we'll be addressing it more next week. But this is why you're starting to get the unrest that we're getting now, where you've got people who feel like they're never going to be able to afford their own home because prices are so high. So more on that next week. But I think it's really interesting that you've got such a simple thing, supply and demand, and it has effects in so many wide-ranging ways, both economic, financial, political, and just about everything else.
And if you understand this, and hopefully you do now, then you can either take advantage of the situation or be punished by not taking action. And as Rob said, we'll look at that next week, because it doesn't mean this is right or fair, but if you understand it, at least it gives you the power of choice. And that's important, because you'll hear all different opinions on property. Some people talking it up all the time, some people hopefully somewhere in the middle like we are, and then people always predicting doom, gloom and crashes every 5 minutes, and this can't continue. Actually, the people who talk about the crashes and property prices, this just can't continue, you hear things like that, but people don't really back it up with anything. They just say it's unsustainable and so on. But it comes down to this, and David Smith summed it up quite nicely in his article, and of course we'll link to it in the show notes. And it says, when supply is weak and demand is strong, prices tend to rise. That happens in all markets. So whether you think this is right, wrong, or indifferent, it's going to happen, because we're not going to solve the issues. We can't solve the housing crisis. We've talked about the reasons why. It's just not going to happen. Something very, very, very dramatic would have to happen for us to solve it. It's not going to go away. There's multiple reasons why we've got demand issues, not just one, and supply issues, there's multiple reasons why we can't solve it. So it's going to take a tremendous amount of work to turn it around. And simply, I can't see it happening unless there's some dramatic social unrest and maybe the whole system changes.
Yeah, so it's a problem. but it's also an opportunity. I mean, this whole thing is why UK property in particular is so attractive for investors. It's because supply and demand is so out of whack, and it will be for what seems like the foreseeable future. The limited space, the growing population, the global demand. UK property over the long term seems like a very attractive investment. And remember, what we said earlier was that supply and demand has an effect over the long term. There are loads and loads of other factors, most of which have an effect over the short term. So we have had the tax changes, and suddenly that's going to have a dramatic and instant impact. Same when it comes to credit, same when it comes to sentiment. These are all factors, but over the long term, you can't get away from supply and demand. That is why UK property is so attractive. That's probably on one level, whether you know it or not, why you're listening to the podcast. If you are investing in property or wanting to, then you are part of the demand problem. We all are. And that ties exactly into what we're going to be talking about next week. It's not necessarily right. It's not necessarily fair, but it is what it is. And when you know what the reality is, then you can decide how to act accordingly. So it's a really interesting topic. It's a big topic. It's a contentious topic. And we're going to come at this from another angle next week. So that is coming up, but there's more coming up in the rest of this show, starting off, of course, with recognising our wonderful iTunes reviewer.
And we say thanks to Pablo, and Pablo's left us a 5-star review which says, very new to investing and found this series only at the weekend. Have listened to pretty much all of them already and learned so much. Many thanks for your help and guidance. I look forward to the next episode. Wow, thank you, Pablo, with over 160. That's quite a commitment, so well done to you. I'm sure it's helped. And Rob, we do like to help. And this week, we're giving not one resource, but two.
Yeah, and it actually looks like we put some thought into these episodes because it ties directly into the main topic. It's a bit of a David Smith special today because it was his news story that kicked the whole thing off, that inspired the main topic, and then you've picked out a book, Rob, by David Smith, Free Lunch, Easily Digestible Economics. Now, I've had this on my Amazon wish list for a very long time because you recommended it to me a while ago. I haven't got round to picking it up yet. Maybe it's a big good point for you to pitch me on and everyone else on why we should.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, David Smith does a great job of making a subject that can seem a little dry, dull and boring. Sorry, David, if you're listening. But the good news is you make it interesting and accessible. So that's why there's plenty of books out there on economics, and I've mentioned a few in the past as well. But this book by David I particularly like, and I highly recommend if it's a subject that's new to you, you're just trying to get into it and want to just understand the basics and some simple concepts, but without falling asleep after reading a page, I recommend it. So we'll link to it. But also, again, link to the subject. If you prefer to consume video, we've mentioned the Khan Academy before as a resource in itself, and it's an online learning platform with multiple courses for free. Very, very good. Check it out. But we're going to link to one in particular that I found while we were putting the notes together for this, that I think will be really useful for people who want to deep dive on this subject a little bit further. So we'll link to that as well. It's about the law of supply, the law of demand. So go and check that out too. So I think this week, Rob, it's definitely one where you need to go to the show notes. So it's thepropertyhub.net/supply and demand.
Yep, loads to get your teeth into there. Next week, more economics. Like I said, we're going to be coming at a similar kind of issue from a different angle, and we're going to be talking about the disappearing middle classes. It's something that we had as our cover feature in the magazine a few months ago, but we've got loads more to say on the subject. It's going to be an interesting one. It could be an uncomfortable one, and it could be a bit of a contentious one, but it's going to be very, very valuable all the same. So we hope you will join us then, and of course, Ask Rob and Rob coming up this Tuesday. Lots more podcast goodness for you. We will keep supplying it as long as you keep on listening. We will...
Ooh, nice sign off.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.